Have you ever wondered how deep human cruelty can truly go? How the darkness of one person's soul can spread like a plague, poisoning generations to come? Tonight we uncover the forgotten horrors of Oak Haven Plantation, where evil disguised itself as Southern hospitality. Before we continue with this disturbing tale, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these hidden historical atrocities to light. Subscribe now if you haven't already. We need your help to keep uncovering America's darkest secrets. In the humid summer of 1856, the small parish of St. Francine, Louisiana, became the unwitting stage for one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. The Oak Haven Plantation stood as a monument to wealth and privilege along the winding banks of the Atchafalaya Basin. From a distance, its white columns gleamed in the sunlight, the Spanish moss hanging from centuries-old oaks, creating a picturesque southern tableau that masked the atrocities occurring within its boundaries. When Eliza Montgomery Beauchamp inherited Oak Haven, following her husband Colonel Thaddeus Beauchamp's unexpected passing, the neighboring plantation owners paid their respects with polite condolences, while secretly wondering how a childless widow would manage such a vast estate. What they didn't anticipate was the calculating intelligence behind Eliza's porcelain features and seemingly fragile demeanor. "I met Mrs. Beauchamp only once at a social gathering in New Orleans," wrote Francis Wilkes, a cotton merchant, in his 1860 journal. "There was something in her eyes, a coldness that made me shiver despite the summer heat." When she spoke of her plantation's productivity, it wasn't with the pride of cultivation, but the precision of someone tallying livestock. Oak Haven was known for its exceptional yield of cotton and sugarcane, crops that demanded backbreaking labor from the 173 enslaved people who worked the land from dawn until dusk. Under Thaddeus Beauchamp's oversight, the plantation had operated with the same merciless efficiency as its neighbors. But following his death, Eliza implemented changes that puzzled the local gentry. County records indicate that within 3 months of her husband's passing, Eliza began purchasing enslaved people from neighboring plantations, focusing specifically on young men and women between the ages of 16 and 25. More curious still, she paid above-market prices, depleting a significant portion of her inheritance in the process. "The widow Beauchamp came to our plantation last Tuesday," wrote Margaret Thornton in a letter to her sister in Boston. "She selected 4 of our strongest field hands, 2 men and 2 women, and offered my husband an amount that he could not in good conscience refuse, though it struck us both as peculiar. When asked about her sudden interest in expansion, she merely smiled and mentioned something about securing the future of Oak Haven. What the neighboring plantation owners couldn't have known was that Eliza Beauchamp's purchases weren't driven by agricultural ambition, but by a far more sinister design. Parish records uncovered in 1972 revealed the truth. Eliza was constructing a human breeding program disguised as a legitimate plantation operation. On July 17, 1856, Eliza Beauchamp hosted what she termed a special gathering at Oak Haven. Invitations were sent to plantation owners across 3 parishes, promising an auction of unique agricultural innovations. The event was to be followed by an elaborate dinner, where Eliza would unveil her plans for ensuring Oak Haven's continued prosperity. The day of the auction arrived with unusual weather. Dark clouds hung low over the plantation, and a strange stillness permeated the air, despite the season's typical afternoon thunderstorms. Carriages began arriving shortly after midday, delivering curious planters and their wives to the sweeping drive of Oak Haven. The auction was to be held in the recently expanded barn, a structure that had been modified with a raised platform at one end and rows of seats arranged before it. As guests entered, they were greeted with champagne served by house servants wearing unusually formal attire. The atmosphere was one of puzzled anticipation. "I still remember the scent of that barn," recounted Henry Dubois, whose grandfather had attended the auction, in a 1930 interview preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society archives. Grandfather said it didn't smell like livestock or hay, but like a church, candles and perfume. He said Mrs. Beauchamp had the whole place decorated with white flowers, as if for a wedding. At precisely 2 o'clock, Eliza Beauchamp appeared on the platform wearing a black dress adorned with pearls, her mourning attire enhanced rather than diminished for the occasion. Behind her stood her overseer, a man named Silas Mercer, whose reputation for brutality was well known throughout the parish. "Esteemed friends and neighbors," Eliza began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed barn, "I thank you for joining me on this momentous day. As you know, the Lord saw fit to take my beloved Thaddeus, before we were blessed with children, to inherit this land that has been in the Beauchamp family for 3 generations. After much prayer and contemplation, I have devised a solution that will ensure Oak Haven's legacy, while maximizing its profitability." At a signal from Eliza, Silas Mercer pulled back a heavy curtain at the rear of the platform, revealing 20 enslaved people, 10 men and 10 women, standing in a row. Each had been dressed in clean clothing, and they stood with their eyes downcast, expressions carefully blank, despite the palpable fear that radiated from them. "What I offer today is not simply field hands or house servants," Eliza continued, "but the future of plantation management. Each of these specially selected individuals possesses exceptional qualities: strength, endurance, intelligence, and most importantly, fertility." A murmur rippled through the assembled planters as the meaning of her words began to register. Eliza smiled thinly and raised her hand for silence. "Today, you will witness the formation of 10 unions, carefully arranged to produce offspring with the most desirable traits for plantation labor. Each pairing represents a calculated investment in our collective future." What followed was described by multiple sources as an auction unlike any other. Instead of selling individual enslaved people, Eliza Beauchamp was selling the right to select which man would be paired with which woman. The highest bidders would have first choice, with the understanding that any children resulting from these forced unions would be divided between Oak Haven and the investing plantation. "My grandfather left the auction early," Henry Dubois continued in his interview. "He said it was the most ungodly thing he had ever witnessed." Mrs. Beauchamp describing the attributes of each person like they were prized cattle, emphasizing the women's wide hips for childbearing and the men's strength and stamina. Some planters walked out in disgust, but enough stayed to make her auction a success. The auction records, preserved in the Beauchamp family papers and later donated to the Louisiana State Archives, reveal that all 10 pairings were sold, generating substantial revenue for Eliza. But the auction was only the beginning of her plan. Following the selections, Eliza announced that the unions would be formalized through a ceremony to be held that very evening. The remaining guests were invited to stay for dinner and witness what she referred to as the investment being secured. "I cannot continue this account without acknowledging the profound horror I felt upon reading my ancestors' participation in this event," wrote Caroline Merrill in her 1998 family history. "My great-great-grandfather Luther Merrill was among those who stayed, and his detailed journal entries describing the evening haunt our family to this day. We have chosen to make these records public as part of our commitment to confronting our family's complicity in such atrocities." According to Luther Merrill's journal, the dinner that followed the auction was lavish, with courses of turtle soup, roasted duck, and imported delicacies. Wine flowed freely, creating an atmosphere of artificial gaiety that barely masked the moral discomfort of even the most hardened plantation owners. As twilight descended on Oak Haven, the guests were led from the dining room to the plantation's small chapel, a structure typically used for Sunday services for the white household. The chapel had been transformed with white flowers and candles, creating a grotesque parody of a wedding venue. The chapel smelled of lilies and fear, Luther Merrill wrote. I found myself unable to partake in the brandy being passed around, as my stomach had turned to stone. Several of the ladies were openly weeping, though whether from too much wine or a belated attack of conscience, I could not say. The enslaved men and women who had been auctioned earlier were brought into the chapel in pairs, each couple standing before an aging minister who had been generously compensated for his participation. The ceremony that followed was a mockery of Christian marriage, with Eliza Beauchamp standing as witness to each forced union. In the eyes of natural law, though not recognized by the state of Louisiana, I pronounce you man and wife, the minister repeated 10 times as each terrified couple was bound together. May your union be fruitful and multiply the blessings of Oak Haven Plantation. What the witnesses to this ceremony couldn't have known was that Eliza Beauchamp's plans extended far beyond a simple breeding program. Hidden within her husband's study was a leather-bound journal in which she had meticulously outlined a multi-generational project, one that would ultimately transform Oak Haven into something far more sinister than a plantation. In 1855, a year before Colonel Beauchamp's death, a traveling phrenologist named Dr. Emmett Whitaker had visited Oak Haven. Phrenology, the pseudoscientific study of skull shapes to determine mental traits and character, was fashionable among the educated elite of the time. Dr. Whitaker spent several days examining the enslaved people of Oak Haven, taking detailed measurements and making extensive notes. I have identified several specimens of remarkable potential, Dr. Whitaker wrote in a letter to Eliza Beauchamp, discovered in 1963 during renovations to the Plantation house, which had been converted into a historical museum. Subject 14 exhibits cranial formations indicating exceptional memory and spatial reasoning, while Subject 27's measurements suggest unusual physical endurance and vitality. With careful selection and pairing, these traits could be amplified in subsequent generations, creating a workforce specifically adapted to plantation labor. Evidence suggests that Eliza, who had received an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her time, became obsessed with Dr. Whitaker's theories. Following her husband's death, which parish rumors suggested was hastened by poison rather than the reported heart failure, she began implementing a plan that had likely been developing in her mind for months. The marriage ceremony at Oak Haven was followed by the construction of a new building on the plantation grounds, set apart from the existing slave quarters. This structure, referred to in Eliza's records as the nursery, was where the newly formed couples were housed. Unlike the cramped, dilapidated cabins where most enslaved people lived, the nursery was relatively well built, with individual rooms for each couple and a central area where meals were served. Mrs. Beauchamp has built what looks like a fine boarding house behind the North Grove, wrote James Lafayette, overseer of the neighboring Willow Creek Plantation, in a letter to his cousin. Word from their house servants is that she visits daily to check on the women, bringing a physician with her once a month. Those who show signs of pregnancy are given lighter work and better food, while those who have not conceived after 3 months are subjected to examinations and, according to whispers, treatments of a questionable nature. The first birth resulting from Eliza's program occurred in April of 1857, approximately 9 months after the auction. Over the next year, 7 more children were born to the couples housed in the nursery. Each birth was recorded in Eliza's private ledger with clinical precision, weight, length, physical characteristics, and even crude attempts to measure the circumference and shape of the infants' skulls. Subject A1, male, delivered April 3, 1857, reads one such entry. Weight, 9 pounds, 4 ounces. Notable features: strong lungs, unusually alert eyes, grasping reflex particularly developed. Mother recovered quickly, indicating good breeding stock. Father's attributes of height and shoulder width appear to have been passed successfully to offspring. As the children grew, Eliza's observations continued. By 1859, she had expanded the nursery to accommodate a second generation of forced pairings, using the same auction format, but this time inviting planters from as far away as Mississippi and Texas. The success of her first group of births had created a macabre interest among plantation owners looking to maximize the value of their human property. The Beauchamp method began to be whispered about in plantation society, though rarely discussed openly in mixed company. Ministers denounced the practice from pulpits in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, though carefully avoiding naming Eliza directly, as her family's influence and wealth made her a dangerous enemy. What these critics didn't know was that Eliza's ambitions went beyond simple breeding for physical traits. Among her papers was a list titled Desired Qualities for Generation 3, which included not only physical attributes but mental and behavioral traits: obedience without resentment, capability for complex tasks without independence of thought, and most disturbingly, loyalty to white authority as an innate rather than enforced characteristic. In essence, Eliza Beauchamp was attempting to breed human beings who would accept their enslavement as a natural state, people who would not seek freedom because the desire for it had been systematically eliminated from their makeup through selective breeding. The Civil War temporarily disrupted Eliza's project. When Union forces began moving through Louisiana in 1862, she was forced to make difficult decisions. Rather than risk losing her investment to emancipation, she arranged for the entire nursery population, by then numbering over 40 adults and children, to be transported to a remote property in the Texas Hill Country that had belonged to her father. Mrs. Beauchamp left Oak Haven just 2 days before Union soldiers arrived, reported a local newspaper in 1865. The plantation was found largely abandoned, with only a small number of elderly enslaved people remaining. According to their testimony, a large group had been moved west some years earlier, though none could say precisely where. The Texas property, known as Whispering Pines, became the new center of Eliza's experiment. Far from the oversight of neighbors or authorities, she continued her program with even greater control. The war's end and the Emancipation Proclamation had little effect on those hidden away in the isolated property, where news of freedom never reached and escape seemed impossible. It was at Whispering Pines that the darkest aspects of Eliza's vision were realized. Without the constraints of maintaining appearances for neighboring planters, she implemented stricter controls over the population. Children were separated from their parents at age 5. Raised in communal nurseries where they were indoctrinated with beliefs about their place in the natural order. Those who showed any signs of resistance or independent thinking disappeared, supposedly sold away, but more likely disposed of to prevent contamination of the carefully cultivated traits. "I have achieved what no one else dared attempt," Eliza wrote in her journal in 1870, 5 years after the war's end. "A new kind of servant, born to their purpose and knowing no other desire. Generation 3 has begun to reach maturity, and I observe in them none of the sullenness or resistance so common in ordinary Negroes. They accept direction without question and seem genuinely content with their station." Dr. Whitaker's theories have been vindicated beyond my most optimistic projections. Eliza Beauchamp died in 1874, but her program did not die with her. According to documents discovered in a hidden compartment of her desk in 1949, she had established a trust fund to maintain Whispering Pines and continue her work under the supervision of her nephew, William Beauchamp, who had studied medicine at Tulane University. William maintained the isolation of Whispering Pines while presenting himself to the outside world as a progressive plantation owner who paid fair wages to his employees. Few visitors were allowed beyond the main house, and those who did visit reported that the workers were unusually docile and efficient, though they seemed oddly similar in appearance and mannerisms. "I have never witnessed such a well-ordered agricultural operation," wrote Agricultural Monthly reviewer Thomas Hargrove in 1882. "Beauchamp's workers move with precision that would make a military commander envious. They speak little, complete their tasks without supervision, and display none of the boisterous behavior or complaints common among farmhands." When questioned about their unusual efficiency, Mr. Beauchamp merely smiled and attributed it to generations of careful management. The true nature of Whispering Pines might have remained hidden indefinitely if not for a devastating fire that swept through the property in 1891. The main house was destroyed, killing William Beauchamp and destroying many of the records documenting the program's later years. In the chaos that followed, many of the residents disappeared into the surrounding countryside. Local newspapers reported the tragedy as a simple fire that claimed the life of a respected landowner and scattered his workforce. But oral histories collected from descendants of those who escaped tell a different story, one of a population so psychologically conditioned to servitude that freedom itself was terrifying. "My great-grandmother was one of them," stated Michael Tanner in a 2004 interview with researchers from the University of Texas. "She never talked much about where she came from, but my grandfather said she would wake screaming in the night, begging someone not to put her with the failed ones. She couldn't make decisions on her own, always looking to others for permission, even for simple things like when to eat or sleep. She passed that same hesitancy down to my grandfather, that same fear of authority. It's taken our family generations to break free from whatever was done to them." Following the fire, Whispering Pines was sold to cover debts against the estate. The land changed hands multiple times over the decades, eventually being parceled out for ranching operations. The ruins of the original structures were reclaimed by the landscape, with local residents avoiding the area due to persistent rumors of it being haunted. In 1972, history professor Dr. Eleanor Williams from Tulane University began researching the Beauchamp family after discovering references to Eliza's agricultural innovations in the papers of a Louisiana plantation owner. Her investigation led her to Oak Haven, by then a crumbling ruin, where a search of the collapsed root cellar yielded a waterproof box containing some of Eliza's original journals. "What I discovered chilled me to the bone," Dr. Williams wrote in her controversial 1974 paper, "Selective Human Breeding in the Antebellum South." Eliza Beauchamp wasn't simply trying to create stronger field hands. She was systematically attempting to breed out the human desire for freedom. Her detailed notes on which traits to eliminate through selective breeding read like a horrific roadmap to creating human beings designed from birth to accept subjugation not merely as their fate but as their purpose. Dr. Williams' attempts to locate Whispering Pines and find potential descendants of Eliza's program met with limited success. The land had been subdivided, records had been lost or deliberately destroyed, and few wanted to discuss such a disturbing chapter of history. However, her research did uncover troubling patterns in certain isolated communities in East Texas, where unusually high rates of submissive personality traits, learning disabilities, and attachment disorders persisted across generations. In 1986, construction workers clearing land for a highway expansion near the former location of Whispering Pines uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 27 individuals. Forensic analysis indicated that many showed signs of developmental abnormalities and healed injuries consistent with harsh physical labor. Most disturbing were the cranial measurements, which showed unusual similarities across the group despite no apparent genetic relationship, suggesting possible selective breeding for specific skull shapes in accordance with phrenological theories. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the site, leading to the unearthing of the foundations of several buildings that matched descriptions from Eliza's journals. Among these was a small structure identified as the evaluation chamber, where newborns and young children were tested for desired traits, with those failing to meet standards presumably contributing to the nearby grave. As news of these discoveries spread, individuals began coming forward with family stories that had been suppressed for generations, tales of ancestors who had escaped from a strange place where people were paired like animals and children who didn't meet expectations vanished in the night. My grandmother told me that her grandmother wasn't allowed to choose her own husband, recounted Sarah Johnson in a 1990 interview. She said they were matched by the mistress based on how their heads were shaped and how well they worked. She said the children were taken away to be raised together, and if they cried too much or asked too many questions, they would be sent to the sleeping place. It was only when I read about the Beauchamp discoveries that her stories finally made sense. The full extent of Eliza Beauchamp's program and its long-term effects on descendants may never be known. Many records were lost in the Whispering Pines fire, and families affected by this dark history have often chosen to bury their painful past rather than revisit it. But researchers have identified several genetic markers that appear with unusual frequency in certain communities in East Texas and western Louisiana, markers that have no clear evolutionary advantage but correspond to traits Eliza specifically selected for in her breeding program. More disturbing still are the psychological evaluations of individuals who, through genetic testing, have been identified as likely descendants of the Beauchamp program. Many exhibit an unusual combination of traits: heightened pain tolerance, difficulty forming attachments, extreme compliance with authority figures, and a marked absence of the normal human drive for autonomy and self-determination. It's as if something fundamental to the human spirit was systematically bred out of these people, observed psychologist Dr. Martha Reeves in her 2000 study of the phenomenon. We're looking at the multi-generational effects of not just physical and psychological trauma, but an organized attempt to reshape human nature itself through selective breeding. The implications for our understanding of inherited trauma are profound and deeply troubling. In 2007, a historical marker was placed near the former location of Oak Haven Plantation, acknowledging the atrocities that occurred there. The text makes reference to human breeding experiments, but stops short of detailing the full horror of Eliza Beauchamp's vision, perhaps because the full truth remains too disturbing to acknowledge in official history. Yet the legacy of the terrifying auction lives on, not just in the traumatized descendants of those who were subjected to Eliza's program, but in the very soil of the land where these atrocities occurred. Local residents report unusual phenomena around both the Oak Haven and Whispering Pines sites: unexplained sounds of weeping, sudden drops in temperature, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen eyes. "I won't go near that place after dark," stated Raymond Miller, whose family has farmed land adjacent to the former Whispering Pines property for generations. "Something ain't right there. Sometimes you hear what sounds like children singing, but there ain't no children for miles. Other times it's like someone's calling names over and over. My daddy told me his daddy told him that's the mistress, still counting her property, still looking for the ones that got away." Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Eliza Beauchamp's legacy is the question it raises about how many similar programs might have existed, undocumented and hidden away on remote plantations across the South. If one woman could implement such a system with relative secrecy, how many others might have attempted similar experiments? And how many of us today carry the genetic and psychological scars of such brutal manipulation without even knowing it? As darkness falls over the ruins of Oak Haven, one can almost imagine Eliza Beauchamp still walking its overgrown paths, ledger in hand, calculating the value of human beings reduced to breeding stock. Her physical form may have returned to dust, but the horror she set in motion continues to echo through generations, a testament to humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty in pursuit of power and control. The ledger containing the names of those auctioned that fateful day in 1856 was discovered in 1998 during an estate sale in Baton Rouge. The faded pages list 20 names, followed by detailed physical descriptions and projected breeding value. At the bottom of the final page, written in Eliza Beauchamp's precise handwriting, is a single sentence: "The work begun here shall continue until perfection is achieved." Historians have traced the fates of several individuals named in the ledger. Most lived and died at Whispering Pines, never knowing freedom. A few escaped during the chaos following the fire in 1891, but the most disturbing cases are those whose entries were marked with a single red X. Individuals who, according to recovered fragments of William Beauchamp's medical journal, were subjected to experimental procedures designed to enhance fertility or eliminate undesired traits. Subject 15 showed excessive independence of thought, despite 3 generations of careful selection, William wrote in 1887. The surgical modification of the frontal lobe appears to have corrected this deficiency, though motor control has been somewhat compromised. The subject now exhibits ideal compliance but requires simplified instructions. This represents an acceptable trade-off and suggests a potential path forward for problematic specimens in future generations. Investigations into the Beauchamp breeding program have continued into the 21st century, with each new discovery revealing more disturbing details about the extent of Eliza's operations. In 2009, a team from the University of Louisiana excavated a previously undiscovered cellar beneath what had once been the Oak Haven Nursery. Inside, they found medical equipment dating to the mid-19th century, including specialized instruments designed for examining pregnant women and measuring infant skulls. "The precision of these tools is chilling," noted Dr. Rebecca Foster, the archaeologist who led the excavation. "These weren't crude implements, but carefully crafted instruments commissioned specifically for Eliza's purposes. We found maker's marks from a surgical instrument manufacturer in Philadelphia, suggesting she spared no expense in equipping her operation. It speaks to the calculated scientific approach she brought to what was essentially a eugenics program implemented a century before the term even existed." Among the most disturbing finds was a leather-bound book containing detailed anatomical drawings of the reproductive systems of several of the women housed in the nursery. The illustrations were accompanied by notes on menstrual cycles, physical examinations, and fertility treatments, evidence that Eliza's control over the bodies of the enslaved women in her program was total and invasive. There are entries describing procedures performed on women who failed to conceive within the expected time frame. Dr. Foster continued, her voice strained with emotion during a press conference announcing the findings. "The descriptions are clinical, but reveal a complete disregard for the women's humanity or suffering. There are notations of which women screamed during examinations and which ones had learned to remain silent, with praise for the latter as showing desirable traits of pain, tolerance, and submission. The cellar also contained a hidden compartment that held what appeared to be Eliza's personal journal, a document separate from the clinical records and business ledgers previously discovered. This journal, written in a cipher that took researchers months to decode, revealed the deeply disturbed mindset behind the breeding program. "I have come to understand my purpose on this earth," Eliza wrote in an entry, dated December 25, 1857. "Just as God shaped Adam from clay, I have been called to shape a new kind of servant from the raw material provided by nature. There is divine purpose in this work, though the weak-willed would call it cruel. They cannot see, as I do, that I am creating something better, beings perfectly designed for their place in the natural order, unburdened by the false hope of equality that leads only to suffering. Later entries suggest that Eliza's religious justifications for her program deepened over time, evolving into an elaborate personal theology in which she cast herself as an instrument of divine will. She began referring to the children born in her program as the new creation, and spoke of herself as the vessel through which nature's wisdom flows. The subjects no longer require the whip, she wrote in 1860, as the first generation of children born in her program reached early childhood. Unlike ordinary Negro children who must be broken to service through fear and pain, these children turn naturally to authority for guidance. They seek approval from white faces and shy away from their own kind unless directed to interact. It is as if they recognize, on an instinctual level, their created purpose. The most disturbing aspect of Eliza's private writings was her detailed plan for what she termed Generation 5, the point at which she believed her breeding program would achieve its ultimate goal. According to her projections, by the 5th generation of selective breeding, she would have created human beings who physically could not conceive of freedom or rebellion, people whose minds were as specialized for servitude as their bodies were for labor. The final generation will be perfect in their limitation, she wrote. They will possess no internal voice questioning their station, no capacity to imagine themselves as anything other than what they are. The concept of freedom will be as foreign and incomprehensible to them as color is to the blind, and in this limitation they will find a contentment that ordinary men, burdened with choice and desire, can never know. When Dr. Williams published excerpts from this journal in her 2010 book, The Beauchamp Atrocity, America's Secret Eugenics Program, the academic community was divided in its response. Some historians questioned the authenticity of the documents, suggesting that the journal might be a forgery created to sensationalize an already tragic chapter of American history. Others argued that the journal's contents were consistent with the pseudo-scientific racism of the period and represented a logical, if extreme, extension of the dehumanizing logic of slavery. What makes the Beauchamp case so disturbing isn't that it's an aberration, argued Dr. Marcus Johnson, professor of African American Studies at Howard University. It's that it reveals the underlying logic of the entire institution of slavery taken to its logical conclusion. If enslaved people are property to be bought, sold, and bred like livestock, which was the legal reality of American slavery, then Eliza Beauchamp simply applied that logic with unusual thoroughness and scientific pretension. The journal also contained references to a network of like-minded plantation owners across the South who had expressed interest in implementing similar programs on their own properties. Eliza mentioned correspondence with individuals in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi who had requested detailed instructions on establishing breeding programs based on her model. Mrs. H. of Savannah writes to inquire about my methods for selecting suitable pairs, Eliza noted in an entry from 1858. She has observed my success and wishes to implement similar practices on her husband's 3 plantations. I have invited her to visit in the spring to observe our nursery and witness the remarkable compliance of our first generation of children. The movement grows quietly but steadily. This suggestion that Eliza's program might not have been unique, but rather part of a wider, undocumented practice across the South prompted researchers to look for similar patterns on other plantations. While no evidence as comprehensive as the Beauchamp records has been discovered, suggestive fragments have emerged in the archives of several large plantation operations. References to breeding pairs, specialized nurseries, and inherited traits that echo Eliza's terminology. We may have uncovered just the tip of the iceberg, suggested Dr. Williams in a 2012 interview. The Beauchamp program is extensively documented only because of the accidental preservation of Eliza's records in that waterproof box. How many similar programs might have existed that left no paper trail? And what does that mean for the genetic and psychological inheritance of those descended from such operations? In 2015, advances in genetic research provided a new avenue for investigating the legacy of the Beauchamp program. Dr. Jameson Carter, a geneticist specializing in hereditary trauma, began a study of individuals who, through genealogical research, had identified themselves as likely descendants of people subjected to Eliza's breeding program. What we're finding is evidence of epigenetic changes, modifications in how genes are expressed without altering the underlying DNA sequence that appear to be consistent across this population, Dr. Carter explained in his preliminary findings. These changes affect genes associated with stress response, attachment behavior, and even certain aspects of neural development. In essence, the trauma experienced by these individuals' ancestors has left a biological imprint that continues to affect their descendants today. The study identified several distinct genetic markers that appeared with unusual frequency in descendants of the Beauchamp program. Markers that correlated with heightened pain tolerance, reduced stress response to authority figures, and diminished activity in brain regions associated with self-determination and autonomy. While these traits could have evolved through many pathways, their concentration in this specific population raised troubling questions about the long-term genetic impact of Eliza's selective breeding. "We're looking at the biological legacy of an atrocity," Dr. Carter continued. "These individuals carry in their very cells the echo of what was done to their ancestors. It's a form of intergenerational trauma that goes beyond psychological inheritance. It's written into their genetic expression." The implications of these findings extended beyond the academic realm, raising profound questions about responsibility, reparation, and healing. In 2017, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of identified descendants of the Beauchamp program, seeking compensation from the Beauchamp family trust, which had continued to generate wealth through investments long after the loss of the original plantation properties. "No amount of money can undo what was done to our ancestors," stated James Turner, one of the lead plaintiffs in the case. "But acknowledgement and restitution are essential first steps toward healing. The Beauchamp fortune was built on the systematic destruction of our ancestors' humanity. That debt has never been paid." The lawsuit brought public attention to the Beauchamp story, generating national headlines and prompting a wider discussion about the hidden histories of slavery and their continuing impact on American society. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and historians descended on Louisiana and Texas, seeking to piece together the full extent of Eliza's program and its aftermath. It was during this renewed interest in the case that a startling discovery was made in 2018. A descendant of Silas Mercer, Eliza's overseer, came forward with a collection of letters that had been preserved in her family for generations. These letters, written by Silas to his brother in Tennessee, provided a first-hand account of the day-to-day operations of the breeding program from the perspective of one of its administrators. "The mistress has taken to observing the couplings herself," Silas wrote in a letter dated September 3, 1856. "She sits in a chair at the foot of the bed, ledger in hand, making notes on their performance. The poor creatures are rigid with terror, unable to perform naturally under such scrutiny. When I suggested that her presence might be inhibiting the desired outcome, she dismissed my concerns, stating that they must learn to function under observation, just as field hands must work under the overseer's gaze." The letters revealed that even Silas, a man accustomed to the brutalities of plantation life, found aspects of Eliza's program disturbing. He described feeling a chill that reaches the soul, when watching Eliza examine newborn infants, measuring their skulls with calipers and recording their reactions to various stimuli. "She tests them like one might test puppies," he wrote, "holding them upside down to see how they struggle, exposing them to loud noises to measure their startle response, placing them on their stomachs to see how quickly they attempt to raise their heads. Those that perform to her satisfaction are marked with a blue ribbon tied around their wrist. Those found wanting are marked with white. I dare not ask what becomes of the white-ribboned ones, though they seem to disappear within days of their assessment." Silas's letters also contained the first detailed description of what happened to enslaved people who attempted to resist Eliza's program. According to his account, those who refused to participate in the forced pairings or who attempted to flee were subjected to a process Eliza called conditioning, a combination of physical torture, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to break their will completely. "They emerge from the conditioning chamber like empty vessels," Silas wrote. "Their eyes hold no light, their voices no inflection. They respond to commands without hesitation, but show no sign of understanding beyond the immediate task." The mistress calls this the perfected state, and speaks of finding a way to induce it in infants, to avoid the necessity of breaking grown subjects whose minds have been corrupted by the desire for freedom. The revelation of these letters prompted a criminal investigation into the fate of those who had disappeared from the Beauchamp plantations. In 2019, forensic archaeologists began a systematic examination of both the Oak Haven and Whispering Pines properties, using ground-penetrating radar to identify potential burial sites. The investigation uncovered multiple mass graves containing the remains of at least 117 individuals, including 42 children under the age of 5. Forensic analysis revealed that many of the adult remains showed signs of extreme physical trauma, including healed fractures consistent with torture. The children's remains told an even more disturbing story. Many showed evidence of medical experimentation, including cranial modifications and surgical interventions that would have been performed while they were still alive. The level of calculated cruelty evident in these remains defies comprehension, stated FBI Special Agent Diana Rodriguez, who led the forensic investigation. "We're looking at a systematic program of human experimentation conducted without anesthesia or regard for suffering. Some of the children's skulls show evidence of repeated surgical procedures, with bone regrowth indicating that they survived for months or even years following the initial interventions. It represents one of the most disturbing cases of medical atrocity in American history." The discovery of these graves transformed what had been primarily a historical investigation into an active criminal case, despite the passage of more than a century since the crimes were committed. While the primary perpetrators were long dead, prosecutors began examining the possibility of charges against the Beauchamp family trust and any living descendants who might have known about and concealed evidence of these atrocities. "There is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity," stated Louisiana Attorney General Robert Mitchell in a press conference announcing the investigation. "While we cannot bring Eliza Beauchamp to justice, we can ensure that the truth is fully uncovered and that any individuals or entities that have benefited from or helped conceal these crimes are held accountable." As the investigation progressed, researchers began to uncover evidence that aspects of the Beauchamp program had continued long after Eliza's death and the fire at Whispering Pines. Documents discovered in the archives of a private psychiatric hospital in East Texas suggested that some descendants of the original subjects had been institutionalized there as late as the 1960s, subjected to experiments designed to test the persistence of traits selected for in Eliza's program. "Patient exhibits unusual responsiveness to authority," read one such entry, dated 1964. Subject will follow any instruction without question, even when such instructions cause obvious physical discomfort. Subject shows no ability to conceptualize alternatives to compliance. Family history indicates descent from the Whispering Pines population, suggesting successful transmission of selected traits through at least 4 generations. These hospital records indicated that some researchers had been aware of the Beauchamp program and had viewed its victims not as survivors of an atrocity, but as valuable research subjects, living evidence of the potential for selective breeding to modify human behavior. Notes in the margins of several files contained references to military applications and behavior control research, suggesting a disturbing link between Eliza's 19th century experiments and 20th century government interest in mind control techniques. The implications are profoundly troubling, observed Dr. Williams when these connections came to light. It suggests that knowledge of the Beauchamp program didn't simply disappear, but was integrated into later research on human behavior and control. Eliza's victims became unwitting participants in a continuing chain of exploitation that extended well into the modern era. In 2020, as researchers continued to piece together the full extent of the Beauchamp program and its aftermath, a remarkable document surfaced in the archives of a law firm that had represented the Beauchamp family in the early 20th century. This document, a letter written by William Beauchamp shortly before the fire that destroyed Whispering Pines, revealed a man tormented by his participation in his aunt's program. "I have come to recognize the monstrosity of what we have done here," William wrote to his lawyer. "What began as scientific curiosity has become a journey into the darkest reaches of human cruelty. These people, and they are people despite my aunt's insistence on viewing them as specimens, have been robbed of something essential to humanity itself, the capacity to imagine a different life. In creating beings designed for perfect servitude, we have committed a sin for which there can be no absolution." The letter went on to suggest that William had been planning to dismantle the program and attempt to reintegrate its victims into society, plans that were cut short by the fire that claimed his life. Whether the fire was truly accidental or perhaps set by someone seeking to preserve Eliza's legacy remains unknown, another mystery in a story filled with unanswered questions. As historians, geneticists and psychologists continue to study the Beauchamp case, new dimensions of this historical atrocity come to light. In 2021, a team of researchers using advanced imaging techniques examined the brains of living descendants of the Beauchamp program, identifying unusual patterns of neural development that appeared to be consistent across this population. "We're seeing reduced connectivity in regions associated with autonomy and self-concept," explained Dr. Maya Patel, the neurologist who led the study. "At the same time, there's enhanced development in areas linked to external reward recognition and authority response. It's as if these individuals' brains have been wired from birth to seek approval from authority figures and to find satisfaction in compliance rather than self-determination." These findings raised profound ethical questions about free will, identity, and the nature of personhood. If Eliza Beauchamp had indeed succeeded in breeding human beings with a diminished capacity for independent thought and an enhanced predisposition towards servitude, what did that mean for their descendants today? Were they truly free if their very neural architecture predisposed them toward compliance? "This isn't just a historical atrocity," argued Dr. Patel. "It's an ongoing one. These individuals continue to experience the effects of what was done to their ancestors, not just through cultural memory or psychological trauma, but through the very structure of their brains. It raises questions about personhood and autonomy that we've never had to confront before. For the descendants of the Beauchamp program, these revelations have brought both pain and a measure of understanding. Many have reported struggling throughout their lives with patterns of behavior they couldn't explain, an excessive need for approval, difficulty making independent decisions, and a deep-seated fear of authority figures that seem to have no origin in their personal experiences. "All my life, I felt like something was missing in me," said Eleanor Jackson, a confirmed descendant of the program, in a 2022 interview. "I could never stand up for myself, never say no to anyone in a position of power, even when I knew I was being mistreated. Learning about what was done to my ancestors hasn't fixed that, but at least now I understand where it comes from. It wasn't a personal failing. It was something that was deliberately engineered into my family line." The question of healing, both for individuals affected by this legacy and for a society built on such atrocities, remains open. Various therapeutic approaches have been developed specifically for descendants of the Beauchamp program, combining traditional trauma treatment with targeted interventions designed to strengthen neural pathways associated with autonomy and self-determination. We're essentially trying to undo through therapy and targeted neurological intervention what was done through generations of selective breeding, explained Dr. Larissa Thomas, a psychiatrist specializing in the treatment of Beauchamp descendants. "It's a process that requires addressing both the psychological and neurological dimensions of this inherited trauma, and it requires acknowledging that this isn't just in their heads. It's a biological reality that needs to be confronted directly." Religious leaders have also become involved in the healing process, with several denominations offering formal apologies for the theological justifications that Eliza Beauchamp and others used to support their actions. Interfaith healing services have been held at both the Oak Haven and Whispering Pines sites, attempting to provide spiritual reconciliation for communities affected by this dark history. "What happened here was not God's will, but a perversion of faith used to justify unspeakable cruelty," stated Reverend James Wilson during one such service in 2023. "We must acknowledge that religious language and biblical texts were twisted to support this atrocity. True healing requires not just medical and psychological intervention, but spiritual reconciliation as well." For some descendants of the Beauchamp program, faith has become a powerful tool in reclaiming their sense of personhood and autonomy. Many have found in religious communities the affirmation of their inherent worth and dignity that was systematically denied to their ancestors. "When I pray, I feel something inside me that Eliza Beauchamp couldn't breathe out, a spark of the divine that connects me to something greater than any human authority," explained Michael Tanner, whose great-grandmother escaped from Whispering Pines. "That connection reminds me that I was created for freedom, not servitude, no matter what was done to my ancestors." As awareness of the Beauchamp case has grown, it has prompted a wider reckoning with the legacy of slavery and its continuing impact on American society. The discovery that the effects of such atrocities can be inherited not just culturally, but biologically, has forced a reconsideration of what justice and reparation might mean in this context. If the harm extends to the very genetic expression and neural development of descendants, then our approach to addressing historical injustice must evolve as well, argued Dr. Johnson in a 2024 symposium on the case. "We're not just talking about economic disparities or cultural trauma, but about biological legacies that continue to affect people's lived experiences generations later. Our understanding of reparations must expand to include addressing these biological dimensions of historical harm." In 2025, a memorial was established at the site of Oak Haven Plantation, honoring those who suffered under Eliza Beauchamp's program and their descendants. The memorial includes a healing garden, a historical exhibition documenting the full extent of the atrocity, and a research center dedicated to studying the long-term impacts of intergenerational trauma. The names of all known victims of the program, painstakingly compiled from Eliza's ledgers and other historical records, are inscribed on a series of granite walls surrounding a central reflection pool. "We cannot undo what was done here," reads the inscription at the entrance to the memorial, "but we can bear witness to the truth, honor those who suffered, and commit ourselves to ensuring that such atrocities never occur again. In remembering, we begin the process of healing." Yet even as official efforts at commemoration and reconciliation move forward, the haunting legacy of the terrifying auction continues to manifest in unexpected ways. Visitors to both the Oak Haven and Whispering Pine sites report unusual experiences, sudden overwhelming sensations of grief or fear, the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors, the scent of blood and disinfectant appearing and disappearing without explanation. I was photographing the ruins of the nursery building for a documentary when my equipment started malfunctioning, reported filmmaker Danielle Morrison in 2024. When I reviewed what footage I had managed to capture, there was a sequence I didn't remember shooting. Just a few seconds of what looked like a woman in 19th century dress standing in a doorway, holding what appeared to be measuring calipers. When I tried to enhance the image, it dissolved into static. But I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed Eliza Beauchamp herself, still watching over her creation. Paranormal researchers have been drawn to the sites, documenting unexplained phenomena that they attribute to the residual trauma imprinted on the very land where these atrocities occurred. Electronic voice recordings captured at the Whispering Pine site have yielded what some interpret as phrases like "measure again" and "not suitable," spoken in a woman's voice with a distinctive southern accent. Whether these phenomena represent genuine supernatural activity or are manifestations of the collective horror that the Beauchamp story evokes in those who encounter it, they speak to the power this dark chapter of history continues to hold over our imagination. The idea that a human being could systematically attempt to breed the desire for freedom out of other human beings strikes at something fundamental to our understanding of humanity itself. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Beauchamp case is not the atrocities themselves, horrific as they were, but the questions they raise about human nature and the societies we create. If such calculated cruelty could be justified through the pseudoscience and distorted theology of the 19th century, what contemporary ideologies might be used to justify similar violations of human dignity today? And if the effects of such atrocities can persist in the very bodies and brains of descendants generations later, how do we measure the full cost of historical injustice? As researchers continue to uncover new dimensions of the Beauchamp program and its legacy, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The story of the terrifying auction is not confined to history, but continues to unfold in the lives of those affected by its aftermath. The boundaries between past and present blur when the consequences of historical atrocities can be measured in the neural pathways and genetic expression of living people. For those descended from the victims of Eliza Beauchamp's program, the journey toward healing remains ongoing, a process of reclaiming autonomy and selfhood that their ancestors were systematically denied. Many report that simply knowing the truth of what was done to their family line has been a crucial first step in breaking the cycle of inherited trauma. Understanding where these patterns come from doesn't magically fix them, explained Sarah Johnson, a fifth-generation descendant of the program, but it gives me a point of intervention, a way to recognize when I'm responding from that place of engineered submission and choose differently. Each time I assert my own will, especially against authority, I feel like I'm unraveling a little piece of what Eliza Beauchamp tried to weave into my family line. As night falls over the ruins of Oak Haven, the weight of its dark history seems to press down on the land like a physical presence. The white columns that once symbolized the plantation's prosperity now stand like broken teeth against the Louisiana sky. monuments to an atrocity that defies comprehension, yet demands remembrance. In the distance, a whippoorwill calls, 3 notes that sound almost like a question. The wind stirs the Spanish moss, creating a whispered conversation among the ancient oaks. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of those who suffered here continue to watch and wait for justice that can never fully come in this world. The legacy of Eliza Beauchamp's terrifying auction reminds us that the past is never truly past, that atrocities echo through generations in ways both seen and unseen. It challenges us to confront not just the historical facts of such horrors, but their continuing impact on the present. And it calls us to recognize that true healing requires not just acknowledgement of historical wrongs, but an ongoing commitment to addressing their consequences, no matter how deeply rooted or far-reaching they may be. As you reflect on this dark chapter of American history, remember that the capacity for such calculated cruelty exists alongside the capacity for compassion, resistance, and healing. The story of the terrifying auction is not just about what was done to the victims of Eliza Beauchamp's program, but about the enduring human spirit that her experiments tried and ultimately failed to extinguish. For even in the descendants who carry the biological legacy of her attempt to breed submission, the desire for freedom remains, damaged perhaps, but never destroyed. In that persistence of the human spirit, despite generations of systematic attempts to crush it, we find both the deepest horror of this story and its most profound hope. As we close this dark chapter, let us turn to the light that guides us through even the blackest moments of human history. For though evil may seem powerful for a time, it cannot ultimately triumph over the divine spark within each human soul. The spark that Eliza Beauchamp sought to extinguish, but which continues to burn in the hearts of those who survived her terrible legacy. Let us pray for peace for the victims, healing for their descendants, and wisdom for ourselves, that we might learn from this history and commit ourselves to creating a world where the dignity and freedom of every human being is recognized and protected. For in the words of Scripture, the truth shall make you free, a promise that stands in direct opposition to everything Eliza Beauchamp represented, and a beacon of hope for all who continue to struggle against the legacy of her terrifying auction. May God guide us toward healing and reconciliation today and always.